Okay, thank you all, and it's a warm welcome from us this evening from Kenya. And I know we are all at different time zones, but we are all really grateful that you've had time to join. And sorry for the technical issue that you could not join using the earlier link, but we are happy to have resolved the problem, and we will proceed with the program. As I said, we appreciate really your presence, and we are delighted to hear from Professor Tristan on his paper on climate change in higher education, a curriculum topography approach, which is really a very interesting program. My name is Jacqueline Nyerere from Kenyatta University, Kenya. This paper that Tristan will be presenting is under the project on transforming universities for a changing climate. And it is part of a working paper series. This is paper number 6 in the series. You will be able to access this paper on the website. The project website will be put on the link on the chat so that you're able to access that. This is a project that is implemented collaboratively involving 5 countries: Brazil, Fiji, Mozambique, Kenya, and the UK. And it's designed in 4 work packages to build theory of university impact, as well as to establish universities as change makers. So part of the activities that are involved in this project include participatory action research process that brings together stakeholders in each of 12 participating universities that are implementing the project across the countries. And it is, as part of the PAR activity, it is expected that they will be able to design and implement an intervention. And part of the interventions that have been suggested by participating universities, especially those in Kenya, include a review of curriculum. And we do hope that through the engagements that we'll have this evening, Tristan will take us through some of the information that we'll need to know in order to implement the projects. We have a session that will include the presentation from Tristan, and also a response from Dr. Rebecca Schender. We do hope that we will keep within 1 hour, 30 minutes. And it's now my pleasure to welcome Professor Tristan. Professor Tristan is a professor of international education at the Institute of Education, University College London. His work focuses on higher education and international development, particularly in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, including issues of access, quality, innovation, and impact. His latest book is Higher Education for and Beyond the Sustainable Development Goals, and he is editor of Compare, a journal of international and comparative education. He is the principal investigator of the Transforming Universities for a Changing Climate project. Welcome, Tristan.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be here. Sorry again for those technical issues, and I think we may have lost a few people there, but fortunately we have a good group still with us, and I'm really looking forward to engaging in this debate. And it is a debate. We have a working paper, and I'll present a few ideas which will hopefully spark some of the discussion, but looking forward very much to hearing your views afterwards, and responses and reactions and critiques in the discussion, and we'll have plenty of time for that afterwards. Great that you could join us at this late stage in what for many is an academic term, and everyone probably quite tired. So I'm glad we've managed to fit this in before we go off, hopefully for some deserved break. So the focus of the webinar today is where climate change should fit in the higher education curriculum. Should it be there at all? And if so, where should it be located? Should there be a discrete course? Should there be some kind of module? Should it be embedded across? In what kind of way, and why, and with what kind of purpose? And the argument that I'd like to put forward today, which may seem like quite a provocative one, is that we shouldn't think about climate change in higher education principally in terms of teaching it or teaching more of it. And I think that's the general approach that's taken, is given the critical challenges that are facing us as a global community, to think about how we can incorporate climate change more and more in our teaching. Now, I'm not for a moment suggesting that there's anything wrong with that. Of course, it's not only important, it's essential that climate change as an issue makes an appearance in the kinds of teaching that take place in higher education. But what I'm going to argue is that should not be our only focus. And in fact, it may not be the most effective one. What I will argue, in fact, is that we should think about a topography of curriculum. We should think primarily about creating a learning environment that's conducive to developing various kinds of understanding and action, value in relation to climate change. But that learning environment includes multiple forms of spaces, some of which are informal taught components, some of which are outside of it, some of which are not even in the university at all. And that they need to include taught spaces, but also self-directed and peer learning spaces of an experiential as well as a theoretical and abstract type. So that's the argument I'll put forward today. And it's a primarily theoretical paper, but as Jacqueline already mentioned, this forms part of a large empirical study of the Transforming Universities for a Changing Climate project, in which a number of our partners are grappling with these ideas in practice. So of course, this account draws on those real life experiences. And I also hope that you will contribute your lived experiences of these issues, as well as your theoretical critiques and comments afterwards. So I'll start off by raising some of the general considerations around the place of learning in climate action, and then look at how these issues might appear in a particular way in relation to higher education. So, of course, climate change education is one that's general across all of education. In fact, 95% of countries claim that they have incorporated climate change education generally into their education system. Of course, it's a different matter how and to what extent that it's actually appearing in the day-to-day life of the taught curriculum, rather than the official curriculum. But certainly in discourse, it's very widespread. But we need to think specifically about the level of higher education in some of the disciplines. More broadly, learning is crucial in the climate crisis and the action to address the crisis, because it is anthropogenic. It has its roots in human societies, and as such, purely technical responses are unlikely to be successful. It's not to say that developments of new technology are not part of the solution. They are, and they also have an educational dimension. But we need a broader transformation of societies, politics, economics, culture, and so forth in order to address this crisis. So that, of course, implicates learning in its different ways. And we need change at different levels. So at the level of states and the economy, but also at the level of communities and individual lives, families, and so forth. So all of those things also implicate learning. The prevention, the addressing the causes of climate change that we associate with mitigation, as well as adaptation to the changes already underway, and regeneration of our environments and communities all implicate learning in different ways. So we need to think about how learning is related to those. But there are some particular dimensions of climate change that mean that learning, in particular deep learning, rather than a rather more surface absorption of messages, is important. First is that climate change is a highly complex issue. It's much more complex than some other health or environmental challenges which have a simple linear solutions. And that means that deep consideration within the curriculum is essential. But we're also facing a highly contested space, the most extreme example of which is outright denial of anthropogenic climate change, which is a reality in many countries, particularly in certain countries, United States, Brazil, and so forth, given recent political changes. But there's also a range of contestations and vested interests, which may not be outright denial, but certainly try to obfuscate and obstruct and delay the process as well, that need to be dealt with, as well as diversity of views within the classroom that require particular forms of attention. And different kinds of learning are brought into play. So we can think about the development of professional education amongst those people who are working directly with environmental or climate issues. But that will always be a minority, well, it will certainly for the time being be a minority of people, but we also need to think about the general education that all citizens receive. And research, as for the empirical research that we do have on this issue, shows conclusively that the simple sharing of information and absorption of knowledge around climate change, while very important, is not usually enough to change people's behaviors and values at the deep level that will shift their action. So we need to think about knowledge, but also skills and competence, but also values that are relevant to this issue, to these issues, values in relation to the natural environment, but also in relation to human communities. And climate change, of course, is a political issue because it involves questioning justice, the different kinds of responsibilities that wealthy countries and communities have, with a greater responsibility for the causes of climate change, and the injustices of the poorer communities and countries facing more critical impacts. So there are significant values elements. There are also questions of experiential learning, so learning about more the knowledge element through skills and through the actual experiences of engaging in climate action. And there are also questions of critical thought in relation to climate change, which are general ones in terms of all education for sustainable development. And the tensions between a more campaigning approach to these issues and ones that involve greater levels of critical thinking. And we'll return to some of these issues when we look specifically at the role of universities. Now, some elements of climate change education and curricular elements are similar in universities in relation to schools, and the majority of research and discussion in this area focuses at the school level. Universities have some distinctive characteristics, the first of which is that universities aren't only educational institutions, they're also, in many cases, research institutions. They also have various public engagement programs. And importantly, they're also primarily, no, not exclusively, primarily for adults and with a lower proportion of the population and on an optional, not a compulsory basis. All of those things make the considerations of the educational and curricular considerations of higher education rather different from schools. And as a result, there is greater nervousness amongst universities in promoting generic skills and civic skills, although massification of higher education, in some cases moving beyond the 50% mark, in some in a few cases, moving towards the 100% of the population mark, do make the civic elements of higher education more relevant. But still a significant nervousness amongst many universities and their staff amongst the promotion of generic skills beyond the academic ones that pertain to their particular disciplines. And because of defense of academic freedom, difficulties in ensuring curricular coverage across the whole of the university, because of the autonomy that lecturers have to determine what they teach in their particular areas. Now, that level of autonomy differs dramatically across different kinds of institutions, across different kinds of countries. But there's certainly challenges there around universalization of any regulations or principles across what is happening in all disciplines and across all lecturers' work in universities. And some real tensions there around how far universities can promote particular values, and indeed whether it's effective for them to do so, given the age and maturity of the learners that they have. There are some important analyses that we have, and this is an important one by Multan Hill et al., a recent one, and I think I saw the lead author of this paper on our participant list, which is great. So hopefully she will perhaps respond to some of these issues in the discussion afterwards. But this is a very useful analysis that allows us to think about the formal curriculum of universities and how climate change issues can be incorporated there. So we can see here 4 quadrants. We've got 2 dimensions here of existing and new structures, and then between a narrower and a broader curricular approach. So we're moving there from piggybacking, which is integrating climate change education into existing units, towards specializing the creation of new ones, towards a broad curricular approach of mainstreaming across all existing structures. And then the final quadrant there, connecting in a transdisciplinary way. So we then have both a broad and new, broad curricular and new structures. So this is a very useful way of understanding the different kinds of approaches that can be taken in the formal curriculum, and some difficult decisions to be taken by universities there. There are a number of cases of creation of a new module relating to climate change that is possible for all students, including in our participating universities in Climate U, in our project. There are also a number of initiatives underway to incorporate issues of climate into existing modules. In some cases, the new units and structures that are created are pushing the boundaries of our conventional disciplinary units. And there is an example also from Climate U of this. One of our participating universities, the University of Sao Paulo, has a very innovative master's course, well, at least a multidisciplinary, very, very hard, of course, to be transdisciplinary in a practical sense, but certainly a very effective multidisciplinary course which presents issues of sustainability and climate change to students from a range of backgrounds. So I think we have good examples internationally of all of these different kinds of approaches, and all of them are important. It's in a practical sense, it's not possible to do away with the existing curricular structures overnight. So we need to work with what we have as well as creating new. I'm going to move on now to linking these considerations of the formal curriculum with what I'm calling a topographical approach. And the formal curriculum, to use a very simple frame of classroom, campus, and community, the formal curriculum can go under the classroom label. So not necessarily a literal classroom. The formal curriculum is engaged with in different physical spaces, but for ease of reference, we can call that classroom. But then we have the space of campus. And again, this might be a physical campus. Obviously, in the era of COVID, we're very rarely engaging with physical campuses. And indeed, there are many universities around the world now that don't have physical campuses at all, or their students may be engaging partially there and partially elsewhere, but and very often a virtual campus. But campus understood as the direct sphere of the university, whether that be physical or virtual, or university work that's conducted in the home or else. And of course, there are many important spheres in the campus for learning about climate change. Some of them will be university-led, so the creation of particular structures in which students can get involved in learning, possibly in relation to a new building or the physical environment or governance generally of the campus. They might be entirely student-led initiatives. They might be artistic or recreational or political structures that students lead, or there might be regular ones. So there are many possibilities, and Charlotte Nussey, who is one of our researchers on the Climate U project, has written a very important paper looking at how artistic as well as political and movement spaces can be very important ones for the learning of climate change. And that's another important role that we can think about in relation to campus. The final space is community. And again, this might be the literal community, local community surrounding a university, but it might be other kinds of communities, professional communities, workplace, volunteering, other kinds of placement, internships, or general political and environmental. University-linked actions which take place outside the boundaries of the physical or virtual university. So the first point is that we need to think about all three of these spheres in an interlocking sense. They are partly discrete, they're partly isolated, but we also hope that there'll be synergies with different spheres. Sometimes these are inbuilt. So for example, you can have a student research project which is out in a community, but there might be reflection on that back in the formal space, or there might be community actions which then become incorporated into the talk program, for example, research studies and so forth. So hopefully there are interactions between these different spheres as well. I'll now present some other features that it's important to take in consideration when we're trying to understand the topography. So these are similar to the kinds of structural features that you might have on a literal, a geographical topography, mapping of topography. So they correspond to those, but there are ways of us trying to understand what the characteristics are of the way that climate change is offered in the curriculum. And these can be used as an analytical tool. There are 12 of these features that are grouped into 3 categories. And in the time available, I'll only be able to go over these very briefly, but if you're interested, the full paper is available for download. The link was put through on the chat earlier, so you can look at these in a more leisurely way, because I'll go through these rather quickly. But the first of the categories is access. So here we're looking at who is able to connect, who is able to actually engage in these curricular opportunities. So is it for everybody or only for some people? It's the availability question. And also, the time scale, the continuity of it. Is it available to people throughout their entire university experience or only at specific times? And on what kind of basis is it made available? Is it compulsory or is it voluntary? And this voluntariness question is a really difficult and crucial one for universities. When there is a cross-cutting module, is it made compulsory for all students or not? It's a very difficult question at universities, of course, and of course, if you don't make something compulsory, then you risk not making it available to all. But if you do, then there are risks associated with possible resentment from students of being obliged to do something which they don't perceive to be part of their program and study. So there are various difficulties around that in terms of decisions around the voluntariness of these activities. The second group of characteristics is ownership, and here the primary one is around the agency associated with initiatives. So who designed and promoted and organized this particular curricular activity? Was it university-led, lecturer-led, or student-led, and who controls the decision-making? And connected with that is whether it's actually certified. So usually university-led initiatives are more likely to have certification. That will change the nature of the activity. And also the degree of openness to modification of, is it a curricular intervention which is predetermined and fixed, or is it one that can actually be adapted by those people who are participating? And the final group of considerations is around what we might call connection, and many different kinds of connections across the formal curriculum. So the extent to which content is embedded in particular courses or other kinds of activities, and its disciplinarity. So some of the multi inter and transdisciplinary questions that we were discussing before. There are also questions of connection with practice. So how applied are these issues? Are they theoretical or more abstract? And what levels of experientiality are they? Do they involve students actually getting involved in action, in climate action, whether that be of a tree planting or a campaign or development of new building or procurement practices or some other kind of climate action? What kinds of collaboration do they involve between students and lecturers, different forms of acting? And finally, transmodality. So looking across teaching, research, community engagement, and campus actions, what extent of porosity or isolation they are between these. And these levels of connection can tell us a lot about the nature of these different initiatives. And I think here we can see all of those elements together. So we've got the 3 spheres there of classroom, campus, and community, and the 12 features for understanding the nature of the curricular intervention. Now, this is primarily an analytical frame. It's a way of mapping what's currently happening in universities and understanding its distribution. And there's no clear hierarchy of spaces or types here. I think all of these spheres are needed, classroom, campus, and community, and it's completely justifiable for there to be a range of different kinds of curricular feature, whether I think it's a positive thing that there's a distribution between university lecturer and student-led initiatives, both certified and non-certified activities, different configurations of connections. So there's not a clear hierarchy, but I think there might be a normative implication here that we need to ensure a good spread. I think a richer learning environment in universities will normally contain a range of different learning opportunities, partly because of differences in learners and what learners need and want and what they are likely to get engaged in, but also because the complexity of climate change, and here we're going back to the initial considerations on those early slides. The complexity of climate change means that we actually need to be doing all of these things at the same time. We need to be developing learning about, for, and through. We need to be thinking about knowledge, skills, and values, different forms of learning for different kinds of people and areas of work. We actually do need all of these things at the same time. So there is also a normative implication here of um, of what universities should be doing in terms of ensuring this range of different kinds of experience. And normally that will involve both a combination of discrete provision, so courses and modules that relate primarily or exclusively to climate change, along with embedding across all disciplines, and involvement in the campus and outside the university. And I'll just finish with a few orienting principles, which are, I think, important to put into the mix for how we might approach all of this. One of which I've mentioned already, which is criticality, and that however urgent climate action might be in the climate emergency, within the educational sphere, we have to maintain an approach of a critical approach to these things, rather than a conditioning or a campaigning approach within an educational institution. And there have been some important analyses along this lines in relation to sustainable development broadly. And that's linked with a non-coercive approach to learning opportunities, partly because we're dealing with adults in universities, so it's inappropriate, but also because students need to be given the autonomy to navigate their own learning skills. And particularly, and this is linking in with the third point here, students already have significant existing knowledge and practice in these areas. In many cases, students are at the forefront of political action and practical action in relation to climate change. So that needs to be part of them. And to introduce a final element that I won't be able to deal with in full, but is another important aspect of any debate on curriculum, and that is around epistemic pluralism. And we need to think also in the curriculum around the multiplicity of knowledge traditions and worldviews and cultural traditions that will enrich what we're doing in universities. And this is particularly important in the context of globalized higher education, which very often leads to a homogenization of perspectives. And in the context of climate justice and more general social justice, in which many views, indigenous knowledge, for example, have been marginalized. So those are some final considerations there. And just to wrap it up then, I would argue that we need to think in terms of a topography of curriculum relating to climate change in the university, diverse learning environment, and that in fact, even though there's a huge amount of work on, an important work on alignment of the work of universities in relation to sustainable development and climate change, we have to accept and to some degree embrace a lack of alignment in some ways. When at the universities, the kind of space that universities present in relation to a learning environment will always be one in which there are spaces of relative autonomy from institutional designs. And I think that is inevitable, and it is also to be embraced. Autonomy in relation to the actions of those working in universities, but also those studying. So we're never always going to be singing from the same hymn sheet, as it were. And in fact, that can be, we can embrace that as an important aspect of our addressing this complex and critical issue. But that doesn't make our task easy. Diversity does not mean laissez-faire. It doesn't mean that anything goes. It means that we need to work incredibly hard in order to curate a rich learning environment in all of those spheres. So there's a huge task facing universities and facing all of those people working within them, and also those studying in them, to maintain an environment of commitment to social justice and a strong engagement in these crucial environmental and political issues. thanks very much, and I look forward to your reactions, comments, and questions.
Thank you very much, Tristan, for taking us through your paper, and key important points I pick. I'm not trying to summarize, but I just need to mention that I've picked the content, curriculum content and mindset change. You've also shown us the multidisciplinary nature of climate change and how this should be packaged to target all the students, as well as the 4 different ways in which this can be integrated. I think these are really key. This is key information that that helps us in thinking through climate change curriculum in higher education. To the participants, please utilize the chat forum to ask your questions. At the end of the response from Dr. Rebecca Schendel, you will be able to also voice your questions in the discussion forum. I'm now honored to welcome Dr. Rebecca Schendel, who is the Managing Director of the Center for International Higher Education at Boston College in the United States of America. Her research focuses on higher education in resource-constrained contexts, with particular emphasis on sub-Saharan Africa, and on questions related to learning, teaching, and faculty development. Rebecca is also a member of the advisory board for the Transforming Universities for a Changing Climate. Very welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline, and thank you, Tristan, for extending the invitation to be with you today and for sharing this paper. I'll keep my response short, especially given the delays at the beginning. I want to be sure that there's plenty of time for the Q&A. But I want to start with acknowledging, I think, what are the real strengths of this contribution to discussions about how universities can and should be involved in questions of climate action. It's obviously a crucially important topic. It's hard to argue otherwise, and I think the paper strongly justifies why discussions about the curriculum are such an important piece of this. The paper also acknowledges, I think, in a really robust way, the myriad ways that students learn, and crucially, the myriad spaces in which that learning happens, including off campus. I think so often discussions of curriculum at all when it comes to higher education, sometimes they acknowledge the sort of informal aspects of curriculum or the co-curricular aspects, but very rarely does it extend into the community. So I think that's a real strength of the paper. There's also a real acknowledgement that all of us as actors in the system are responsible for updating what it is we do in order to address this crisis, and that just continuing with the status quo is not going to be tenable. I also think a strength of the paper is the acknowledgement of the particular features of higher education, in particular the agency, the student agency, and also faculty agency, academic freedom, if you want to call it that, and also the importance of prior knowledge when you're talking about a community of essentially adults. And I think the model that you've put together acknowledges all of this and puts it together in a really comprehensive way. And it's if nothing else, a really useful way, I think, that institutions can map what is currently happening on their campus. For those of you who have not yet had a chance to see the paper in its full, at the end of the paper, there is an example, a model of how this model can be sort of operationalized in terms of thinking about how different interventions might map across the different aspects of the topography that Tristan just outlined. And I think that is a crucially useful tool that institutions that are trying to think about this can use as part of their discussion. I guess what I would love to really focus the rest of the response on is the sort of what we can do with a model like this, what we can do with these kinds of conversations and how they should be advanced. I know at the end, Tristan, you started to get into whether this is a normative discussion or not. And I think that was my major question when I first read the paper. Is this just about understanding what is happening within universities and mapping it and getting a sense? Or is there a normative aspect to this? Should we be aspiring towards a particular balance between these different aspects? Should we be, if so, how do we decide what that appropriate balance is? Is that a process that happens through deliberation? If so, who is at the table? What does that look like in terms of creating an end goal for a particular institution or for a system? Then if we were assuming that there is a normative aspect and that we do agree that this is important and we should be striving towards a particular ideal, whatever that might look like distribution-wise, then I think the real question is, how does it happen? In most cases, this is a change for institutions. And so how does that change occur? And I think the problem with comprehensive models. Comprehensive models are useful in that they acknowledge all of the many things that go into it, but comprehensive models are also like highly complex. And so thinking about how you actually do something with a super complicated model is an important question. There's lots of reasons why actors in higher education systems can't or don't want to prioritize this over other aspects of their lives, whether that be students, faculty, or administrators. So thinking about where we go from here is, I think, an important question. So I had a few thoughts on that front. So first of all, the question of who is responsible for thinking about this, or who is responsible for advancing a particular intention, especially in parts of the world and in systems where institutions are still quite loosely coupled and don't have sort of a centralized driving force in the way that perhaps a school might have. Where are these decisions made? Are these decisions made at the institutional level? Does it need to be below that at the departmental or programmatic level? Does it need to be above that in terms of the whole system? Who should be coordinating these necessary discussions that have to happen if you're trying to think about all the different places in which students learn? How might, for example, accreditation agencies be involved? I know in the paper you mentioned this briefly. We didn't talk about it today, but is there a role for accreditation agencies? Is this something that we are saying you must do in order to be considered a high quality higher education institution in today's context? And if so, what would that look like? Is this something we want to evaluate or assess? Are we going to be assessing student learning against this, including all of the different ways in which students might learn? If you think about all the other things that we have our students learn in higher education, we tend to only assess the formal curriculum. Is that what we should be doing? Should we be thinking broader than this? And if so, how does that happen? And then really importantly, how do we motivate and support actors to prioritize this, given everything else that they have on their plate, other pressures they may be feeling? We know from other work on curricular change and pedagogical change that even faculty who are motivated to change the way that they are teaching don't necessarily always have the support to do that, the training to do that. They don't necessarily have the time to rethink how they're doing things. So how that might look like, what that might look like. And then I guess to close, thinking about some contextual factors, because of course, this looks different in different parts of the world. This looks different in different kinds of institutions. I'm sitting in the US, and in the US context, by and large, there isn't really a concept of the curriculum at the higher education level. Students have agency down to the point of choosing their classes. So almost all of them. When I was an undergraduate, I think I had 8 required classes that I had to take. Everything else was my choice. And that was a particularly strong extreme, probably on one end, but that exists. So what does this look like in that kind of a context versus a context where your curriculum is set and you march through higher education along with a cohort in a set order of courses? How is the model flexible across those different curricular models, I guess? And how does it vary depending on funding levels within a system? How much funding is required to think about this sort of broad topography of student learning? And finally, how might it vary depending on institutional autonomy or how universities are governed? If we think this is best handled at the institutional level, how does it look different in contexts where institutions don't have the power to set curriculum, but might have the power to do other things? How might that look different from places where institutions have full control over those factors? I know that's a whole lot of questions rather than answers, but those were the kinds of things that I was thinking about listening to you talk, Tristan, and I imagine others in the webinar might be thinking along those lines as well. So I think I'll close there because I want to be sure you have a good half an hour to hear from the rest of the participants. So thanks so much again for sharing the paper and for inviting me today.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, for that. It's your questions are thought-provoking, and I think these are questions that we all need to be thinking about to discuss in the forum that we have here this evening. We are now open to taking in questions and comments from the participants. Just picking on from what Rebecca has said, how applicable is the model that is suggested across different contexts? And I think this is something that we can all relate with in terms of curriculum at higher education. They are all very different ways of approaching this. They are all also very different levels of approvals, depending on whether it's a degree program, you're doing it as a certificate or extra course in the institution. And all these are questions that we need to really be thinking about. We are also challenged to think about who is really responsible in terms of making decisions, of course, in different contexts. The approvals at the national level, but also there are those that perhaps if it's a curriculum change that targets a very small content level, then it can be done at the institutional level. These are all things that we need to be thinking about, how much content, curriculum content we need to bring on board, and how does that impact the decision making, whether it's going to face the challenge of acceptance at different levels or not. And should the students' learning be assessed? I think that's also another question. That allows me now to just ask the first question. I know we have some questions on the chat, and we'll also allow the participants to voice some of these questions. The question that I have relates to the mindset change or the attitude change and curriculum. There are some cases where perhaps depending on the level, or depending on the integration or the type of integration of the content on climate change or any other content in curriculum, there are those levels where students, for instance, if it's a common university course where students would feel like this is simply a course I'm taking because it's a requirement for me, and once I'm done with that, I've sat my examinations and there's nothing that is left for me there. How do we package this content on climate change, considering that there are students in other disciplines who don't really feel like they should be learning about climate change? Students maybe of engineering, medicine, and certain schools who feel like this is a course that is meant for environmental students. How do we package this to gain acceptance across the board, and also change attitudes of students rather than just going to class and being assessed for it, but changing that for long-term impact?
Thanks very much, Jacqueline, and also Rebecca, for your comments before, and I'll hopefully address some of the questions you raised as well in the course of the discussion. But yeah, I mean, it is a huge challenge how to incorporate this, and I think we need to set all of this in a broader context of higher education in recent years, which has been one of very rapid expansion and incorporation of new populations into the university from different social groups, some of whom are from lower income groups, very often working, sometimes working full-time and studying part-time. And all of these things change the relationship between students and universities, and change the perception of universities and society, and the roles that are attributed to them, and can make very difficult some of the things that we're talking about today, because I think it's difficult to show the empirical link, but I think the processes of marketization of higher education that have taken place all the way around the world have intensified a sense of university as a place of vocational or professional training with an exchange value in the labour market. And of course, that's not universal, and of course, it's not true that students only go to university for those ends. But I think you can observe a broader trend that is in many cases squeezing out the possibility of aspects of learning in higher education that aren't of immediate instrumental and exchange value in relation to the achievement of a certificate that can then enhance employment opportunities afterwards. And that, of course, has knock-on difficulties for the things that you're raising, Jacqueline, because, of course, we all know that we resent being made to study things that we don't feel are immediately relevant for our objectives, and so do undergraduate students and so forth. So that process is a very difficult one. And of course, as teachers, it can be difficult to incorporate new elements that we don't consider to be essential. I think the first response to make to that is that climate change is inevitably going to be part of all disciplinary areas. If it isn't already, it's soon going to be clear that it's almost impossible to be teaching an area in the university which does not have some quite significant relevance of climate change. because, whether you are in, areas that are very obvious, such as environmental science or geography, to areas that may not initially seem like it, like economics, but if you start to see the potential economic impacts of some of these things, it's almost impossible to have an economics course without reference to some of these issues now. Even to arts and humanities courses where perhaps the links aren't quite so evident, but of course, as these themes start to come through in literature and so forth. So, any good disciplinary treatment, even in a traditional sense, will now start to incorporate some of these issues. So I think that's the first thing. Although there's obviously a lag, there is a process of sort of gradual incorporation, but I think more and more that's the case. And I think we need to think across these different elements. I mean, some of, we're thinking mainly in terms of the knowledge component here and sort of information and incorporation into the syllabus, as it were. But these things are closely connected. So there really is a very strong interaction between the knowledge, skill, and values elements. In fact, we can talk about them separately, but it is very hard to separate them out. And Rebecca and I have previously been involved in a project on critical thinking, and this is a good example of that, where it's very hard to have the skill of being critical without a disposition, and vice versa. So these things are close. The knowledge about climate change and the kinds of values that are conducive to climate action are very closely linked, and one can challenge and enhance the other. And just a final comment on that is around the kinds of resistance that students and lecturers can have to some of these curricular changes is very often the fruit of a perception of hypocrisy. So and this is true at all levels of education, very often schools and universities are required to incorporate certain social goals in the messaging that they're delivering through the teaching that they give, but very often the institutions aren't actually doing those things, whatever we're talking about, whether it's about the environment or gender equality or democracy or whatever the goal might be. And so I think this kind of embodiment of these ideas within the institution is important also in terms of avoiding that kind of conflict and hypocrisy. So thanks. Yeah, just a few reflections on that.
Thank you very much, Tristan, for those responses. We do have some questions on the chat. You can ask. Petra, are you able to ask your question? You can just unmute and ask your question.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted now. Yeah. We
can hear you. Can you please go ahead?
Sorry, I wasn't prepared that that I'm speaking. Sorry, I'm on the wrong computer. I don't have a video because I was watching. Yeah, I think my main question is actually the first one I posed is whether you differentiate between climate change science education, climate change mitigation education, and climate change adaptation education. I think this is important because I think we often associate climate change education with a science, which is obviously we then think, okay, it has to be done in geography or something, any of the natural sciences. But I think it's really important that we have there's climate change mitigation education and adaptation education, which is really, for example, like in business, the way how do you integrate climate solutions in the different companies and so on. So it's really kind of how can you mitigate climate change now by actually doing the right things in greenhouse gas management, in the supply chain, and so on. So do you cover this in your project or also in your thinking kind of? And I would be really interested to hear more thoughts on this one.
Yeah, thank you, Petra, for that question. Tristan, is it clear?
Yeah, that is. Thanks. That's a really important point. And I think that the immediate answer is that in this paper, particularly, the distinctions between those aren't fully brought out. I mean, I think if it's not too bland an answer, I think all of those things need to be incorporated. And I think the location, the sphere in which different kinds of learning take place will relate to one or more of those. And I think that all of them are essential, and of course they're closely related. So I think some level of understanding of climate science is essential for both mitigation and adaptation in order to know what, I suppose you can, you could adopt certain behaviors without having any understanding of why you're doing it. But it's not a very, satisfactory or sustainable way of bringing about change in behavior. So I think some level of understanding of climate science has to underpin mitigation and adaptation. Although, of course, we have to be realistic about the depth. I mean, you can spend your entire career, in the complexities of climate science, and I think the level of scientific understanding that's necessary in order to make the changes needed in people's personal lives and in their political engagements. I think we need to think about what's realistic in that sense, in terms of the coverage. But certainly some level of that, and again, some distinctions between, I think, understanding and engaging in both mitigation and adaptation are essential as part of what universities are doing, and regeneration, and understanding the interactions between them. And of course, some interventions are both relate both to mitigation and adaptation. In some contexts, there's a more pressing need for adaptation than others. In other contexts, there's a more pressing need for mitigation, depending on where in the world we're talking about, what kind of institutions. So there will be differences there. But I think ideally they would be integrated, because at the end of the day, all human beings are going to have some responsibility for mitigation and some pressing need for adaptation. So I think it's inevitable we'll have to deal with both. All of these.
Great. We have a hand up from Maureen. Maureen, please take the floor. Maureen? You're muted, Maureen. Please unmute. Okay, I think we can come to Maureen later. She's still muted. But there is a question also on the chat from Louis Gomez. Louis, are you able to ask your question? You can unmute and ask the question. Yes, Louis? Louis, we cannot hear you. I see you unmuted, but we cannot hear you. Okay, Maureen, I see you have unmuted. We can go to you, Maureen.
Good evening.
Yes, good evening.
This is not Maureen, this is Kimadi.
Oh, okay, sorry, it's the name on the screen.
It's okay, I understand. Thank you very much for the invite. I would wish to comment on the element of how to make it adaptable to the teaching and the curriculum of higher institutions learning. And I particularly would wish to mention that motivation would lead to acceptability of the mitigation. And if that one is connected to entrepreneurship when delivering the curriculum, I feel that one would be more acceptable and would raise the level of acceptability to the staff or lecturers who will be delivering the curriculum, the students who will be receiving it alike. That is my comment.
Thanks very much for that, but I'm afraid that the line was breaking up quite a lot, so I think I missed the essence of that. It was around what might be acceptable for students and lecturers, but I'm really sorry I didn't catch the main part of that because of the line.
Motivation should be a factor in delivering the necessary materials for climate change and acceptability to the faculty who will be delivering that, and the students alike, and the element of entrepreneurial in delivering or carrying out the teaching, and the students themselves who will be handling that. Should you think about climate change mitigation as a factor in entrepreneurship?
Entrepreneurship, was that?
Business.
Business, right.
As a business, yes.
Sure, yeah. No, thanks for your question. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, you know, these are one of the absolutely crucial areas in which you know, we need to engage. So I think, you know, higher education has this very rich potential role in forming human beings who are going on to have specific roles in society, in quite often influential roles as different forms of professional, and in some cases starting up their own businesses, entrepreneurs, and also working in organizations with particular practices. And I think one of the really problematic aspects of capitalism is the fact that particularly in large corporations, in profit-making corporations, people's good instincts and motivations have to be subordinated to their career interests. I think this is a massive problem, and it makes good people do either little or nothing, or sometimes bad things. So I think in universities have a huge responsibility in this respect, both to forge the businesses and organizations of the future in creating organizational structures and missions and so forth that will genuinely protect the environment and communities, and not just the kind of lip service you very often get, the sort of corporate social responsibility. And you know, there are some unfortunate examples in relation to climate of things that businesses have done in a rhetorical way to show their green credentials, and it's not really making much of a difference. So I think we need to think about, and you know, I know in business schools, because I was recently participating in a business school conference relating to climate action, and I think in business schools there is a lot of appetite and emphasis for this now, but it's a difficult task they have, of course, to bring this kind of change, both organizationally and also in terms of the individual students and their courage and ethical postures who are going out into the world. And of course, part of that is around entrepreneurship and social enterprise. And I think these are crucial aspects of the kinds of students who are being formed and going out into the world, as long as it's not at the expense of collective action. Because I think we need to avoid a focus on entrepreneurship that sees the only contribution that people can make in society is by setting up a business or something like that. I mean, that might be one, but also, you know, students are also going out to be citizens as part of a collective, and they also need to think about their civic role and responsibilities as well as their purely economic role. As long as we can see those going together, then there is a very important role. Thanks for your question.
Thank you for that. Louis is not able to voice his question because the mic is not working well. I can read it out to you, Tristan. Is it possible is it possible to the lack of professors training and budget or financial support as one of the difficult to approach about climate change at in university more frequently? So I think the question here is about a lack of training or capacity and also finances in terms of implementing curriculum at university level. So he's asking, is that the problem? Is it the capacity and lack of finances?
Thanks. Thanks very much for that. I think it links in also with some of the things Rebecca was raising earlier, which is good. So we can cover some of those. Yeah, of course, this is a very difficult one. I mean, the whole question of support for lecturers is one that goes beyond climate change education. In fact, is a huge issue and question globally, and has been historically, because of the fact that, you know, university professors, at least if we think about the traditional research intensive universities, lecturers have historically seen themselves as scientists or historians or whatever it might be in the first place, and only secondarily as teachers. I mean, that might be a bit of a stereotype, and of course it's not always true, but I think there's certainly a tendency in that. So the whole question of pedagogy in higher education and a systematic or reflexive design of curriculum is a very complicated one, and most countries now are paying more attention to this, and most institutions are paying more attention to this, and there's a lot of transformation underway in that regard. But it's a very difficult process because of lecture autonomy and academic freedom, and there's a lot of resistance to these kinds of courses. And to be fair, sometimes the provision and support that's provided isn't perhaps the most helpful. So there's a lot to be done in that regard, and that's only in general issues of before we come to climate change specifically. I think it's really important to have not to slip into a rather kind of deficit approach to lecturers in this regard. And I think we need to be really careful, and this applies to school levels where it's much more of an issue, particularly, but also to university level, of seeing teachers as kind of instruments for our social designs. So, I mean, this is not only kind of morally and professionally wrong, but it's destined to complete failure, because teachers at all levels, you know, are human beings who interact with their environments, and they create learning environments that are around them, and they can't be used as instruments, and they shouldn't be used. So, and we wouldn't want that to happen to ourselves in our own teaching. So I think we need opportunities for creative engagements with people who are teaching at different levels. For the most part, you know, lecturers are really wanting to continuously improve their practice and are committed to improving their climate education. They may be seeking opportunities to do that, they may not be. So I think it's a question of providing those opportunities for people to do that, and also raising awareness when people maybe haven't thought about. There are differences in certain kinds of institutions. So I think, you know, if we're thinking from the kind of, you know, the research intensive university question, it's one set of dynamics. But of course, we mustn't forget that the real expansion in higher education recently has taken place in different kinds of institutions. So teaching only institution, online universities, different forms of distance education, for-profit chains, many of which have more standardized curriculum. In many cases, a much more standardized curriculum is actually desirable at the higher education level, I think is a problematic thing in themselves. But in those situations, there is actually much more central control over what's happening. And then I think in that case, the onus of responsibility really is on the institutions or chains who are developing that standardization of the curricula to think about how they can incorporate some of these environmental aspects more effectively into what they do. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I'm following the questions as they appear on the chat. We have Sonia. Sonia, are you able to ask your question? You can unmute and ask your question.
I think her microphone, she can't unmute her microphone.
You need to unmute. You're muted.
Her mic isn't working, I think.
Okay. I can ask the question on behalf of Sonia. Did I lose the question? Sorry. Great discussion to look at university curriculum and to recognize communities and students' experience-based knowledge. Could you develop more on this, please? I don't know. That's what the question at the end is. Could you develop more on this, please? That's the question.
Is that about students' existing knowledge? Was that? Yeah.
Yeah, it's about university curriculum and to recognize communities and students' experiences-based knowledge.
Yeah. Well, again, I suppose there's a generic element here of sort of pedagogy 101. You know that if you want to teach well, you have to be very aware of what students already know. So sort of, sorry for a very banal point, but I think that also applies here. There is perhaps a deeper element here, and that we're getting into more the ideas of Paulo Freire, where if climate change education is going to be transformative, then it needs to engage with learners as subjects rather than objects of their learning experience, and not just because it's an efficient and effective learning strategy, but also because it's the only way to truly transform our societies. So I think we can see climate change as a Freirean issue of injustice and oppression. If we're thinking about the kinds of injustices that have brought us to the situation where we are, of a particular worldview of accumulation of knowledge for the purposes of exploiting the natural environment and less fortunate human beings for the enrichment of a few. If we're thinking of that kind of model that has really got us into the mess we are at the moment, we're only really going to be able to solve this with a deep transformation of our societies and economies and political situation. And I share with Freire the idea that that's only really going to take place if people are transformed through their learning experiences in a ways that leads to their empowerment through a learning experience as agents in the world. So there is there's a more surface element to this, which is that in order to teach people well about climate change, you need to build on what they know. And in many cases, they know a lot already. Of course, it depends on the level of education and so forth, but there's the surveys that have been carried out in different parts of the world show that students are strongly engaged in questions of climate change, and they have sources of information beyond the university that often make them very informed. They're often very engaged in political campaigns, so it's important to build on that. But also there is a deeper need for that kind of engagement in order to empower learners, particularly from disadvantaged groups, to challenge the injustices of their lives and to ensure the kind of transformation that's needed to really resolve this issue in the long term. Thanks.
I'm sorry, we may not be able to take all the questions that are on the chat because of time. I would like to allow Rebecca to give us her final remarks, just going through the questions and the comments that have been raised, if there's anything that you'd like to add.
I think the only thing I would say is actually just, I'm glad you ended on that note, Tristan, because that was the one thing I also noticed it in the chat that I hadn't had a chance to speak about, and I don't think you had either, which is the potential danger of the kind of information that just disempowers people, that sort of eco-anxiety phenomenon that people know a lot and don't know what to do about it. And I think if universities focus too much on the knowledge piece and not the psychological piece, the action support piece, we almost run the risk of doing more harm than good if we just paralyze a whole generation of people to feel that their lives are doomed and there's nothing they can do about it. So I'm glad you ended with that, because I think it's often a piece that's not brought up as much when we think about curriculum, is the psychological aspect of how students engage with what they're learning and what they can do about it. But of course, that further complicates all the complications I raised before, but it's an important thing to keep in mind. Thanks.
Many thanks for that, and really we regret from our end that we're not able to take all the questions. We see there are some comments on the chat, and we appreciate the participation of all of you. We also welcome you to visit the website for a recording on this, and also the previous webinars that we've had on this, as well as more information on the project. We also have a Twitter handle. You can follow us. I don't know if Charlie, you've been able to post that as well, so that members can also, so we can also continue the conversation on all those channels. Thank you very much, and happy holidays to each and every one of you.
Thank you very much, and do get in touch. We look forward to, if you haven't been able to ask a question, please do get in touch, and if you're interested in the project. Thank you very much to everyone, and thank you, Rebecca and Jacqueline, for your chairing and response today.